Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm seeing people come in from the waiting room, so we'll wait just a couple seconds here as we have more participants join. Thank you again for joining us this evening. We'll get started momentarily. Wonderful seeing you all come in now. Okay, great. So good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Stephanie Barnett, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the Greenwich Historical Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you as we present our annual Shining Light Lecture Series dedicated to elevating and amplifying underrepresented voices in local history in order to highlight the stories, research, and people who are dedicated to interpreting, restoring, and preserving those histories. Funding for this project is made possible by the state of Connecticut and the National Endowment for the Humanities, both of which provide significant support to Connecticut humanities. We are pleased to kick off this year's series with a talk by Dr. Katherine Hermes, publisher and executive director of Connecticut Explored magazine and lead consulting researcher for the Ancient Burying Ground Association project, Uncovering Their History. This program is presented in partnership with the Ancient Burying Ground Association, a nonprofit group that oversees the ancient burying. Established in 1640, the Ancient Burying Ground is the oldest surviving colonial site in Hartford. It's located at the corner of Main and Gold Streets, adjacent to Center Church, and is open daily. You can find out more about the Ancient Burying Ground on their website, theancientburyingground.org, and we'll be sending out more information about that after the talk as well. Funding for the project on the behalf of the Ancient Burying Ground Association is also provided by CT Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. Before we dive into tonight's program, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping details. This program is going to be 75 minutes long, concluding with a question and answer session. So you can put your questions throughout the program at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A portion that you see on the webinar screen. So if anything pops up during Dr. Hermes' talk, feel free to start putting your questions in there, and we'll complete a Q&A session at the end. And we are also going to be recording this webinar and sharing it on our website for your viewing after the program concludes. It is now my pleasure to introduce the speaker for the evening, Dr. Katherine Hermes, University of California, Irvine, a JD from Duke University School of Law, and a PhD from Yale University. She has taught early American history at the University of Otago in New Zealand and at Central Connecticut State University, where she also served as department chair. She is currently publisher and executive director of Connecticut Explored magazine, a nonprofit history produced for readers interested in Connecticut's past. She has created and been involved in a number of digital history projects and currently serves on the board of trustees of the Institute for American Indian Studies. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Hermes here with us tonight, and without further ado, I will pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm a great fan of the Greenwich Historical Society. So I know we're going to have a good session tonight. I'm going to present my PowerPoint and talk about the extraordinary women who are in the Ancient Burying Ground, and then I look forward to a robust Q&A. All right, so I hope everybody can see that, and you'll let me know if there's any problem. This is part of a new project for the Ancient Burying Ground. I did the Uncovering Their History project in 2018 and 2019, where I looked for people of color, Native Americans, Africans, and African Americans who were buried in the Ancient Burying Ground between 1640 and 1815. And the Ancient Burying Ground Association came back and asked me if I could do a project just on women's lives. And so while you can't cover everything, I've tried to give you a snapshot of what's there. In the Ancient Burying Ground, there are 422 extant stones that you can actually see on a new exhibit on the website. Heritage consultants and Elizabeth Correa took photographs of all of the stones, headstones and footstones, and it's a beautiful exhibit with a downloadable database So go on the website and take a look at that. But 230 of those stones have the name of a woman carved on them. And as Stephanie said, the ancient burying ground is located on the corner of Main and Gold Streets, right in the center of Hartford. But I'll bet that many of you, if you've been to Hartford, have walked right by it and never walked into it. It's behind a bus stop. There's Center Church in front of it. It's a very busy corner. And a lot of people just never even realize that the ancient burying ground is there. It once covered probably about 6 acres, and it's now down to 1 1/3 acres. There could be as many as 6,000 people buried in the ancient burying ground, half of whom were probably female, since women make up half the population. And I'm going to start with the first people of the Hartford area. It was a village called Sukiog. And Sequasin, who was the sachem and the son of Soig, the grand sachem of the Wangunk, invited the English to come to Hartford and settle with him. And I think that he may have, I mean, I'm speculating here, but based on accounts in English colonial records, it sounds like he expected the settlers to kind of settle alongside of him, but that's not really what happened. But many Wangunk people remained in the Hartford area right up until the 1740s. There were even still wigwams around the South Meadow. And if you've ever been to Colt Park in Hartford, you know that one of the streets is called Wawarme. Wawarme was a daughter of Soig, and she was married to my Aunt Nomi, the grand sachem of the Narragansett. So the Wangunk were a very powerful people with lots of diplomatic ties around the area. And I'm going to tell you the story right now of one Wangunk woman, a granddaughter of Soig, who is probably buried in the ancient burying ground. And her name is Sarah Onepenny the Elder, who was a sunk squaw, meaning an elder leader. As a granddaughter of Soig, she had kind of quasi-chiefly status among the women. And Sarah Onepenny was probably born around 1640. We don't have an exact birth date, but during King Philip's War in 1675 and 76, her father, the sachem Onepenny, went to fight with the English up in Springfield. Something happened there, and the Wangunk deserted, or at least some of them did. And the next thing we know about Sarah Onepenny, she's in a kind of quasi-prison camp with a group of Native people called the Surrenderers over by the Shetucket and Quinnebog rivers. And in order to get out of that camp, she had to spend 10 years there and then agree to live as a colonist. Well, right around that time, right around 1686, William Whiting, a colonel in the colonial militia, and the son of Reverend John Whiting, was getting married, and he needed household help. And Sarah Onepenny came to live in his house. In 1713, as she lay dying, she recorded an incumpative will, an oral will. Gathered around her on a May day in 1713 were her sister, William Whiting's daughter, Mary, William Whiting, her sons, Nana Maroose, Sienna, and Cushoy. And they listened to her give instructions about what she wanted done with her land in the South Meadow and how she wanted to pay her debts and funeral expenses. In the incumpative will that appears in the Hartford probate records, she says that she wants to leave all of her land in the South Meadow to her grandson, Scipio. And Scipio was a young man born to Sarah Onepenny's daughter, Alice, and an unnamed African man. So he was of mixed heritage. And I think that she was probably trying to protect him making sure that he had land and that he had status. And she named William Whiting as his guardian. And that turned out to be a good thing for Scipio in a way, because Whiting had that land surveyed, and that land would later launch Scipio into a career as a carter in Newport, Rhode Island. But as she lay dying in Hartford, she told her sons that she wanted them to sell some land in Middletown to pay her debts and pay her funeral expenses. And they carried out those wishes with the permission of the general court. What makes Sarah Onepenny the Elder such a unique person and such an important person is not just that she laid her signature to many deeds, including a deed signed in Wethersfield called the Eastbury deed, and her daughter signed deeds in what we now call Durham, but Coconchog, but also that this practice of creating a will was something passed down through many Wangunk families. And a child that was placed into her guardianship, Amy Puamskin, wound up also writing a will. And of the 56 Native American estates that I've found in the Connecticut probate records, many of them have family ties to Sarah Onepenny, or they were soldiers connected with William Whiting. There are quite a few Native women in Hartford's ancient burying ground, and a lot of people have asked me why a Native person would want to be buried there. The burying ground was really open to all comers. Anyone who died in Hartford could be buried in the burying ground, and they probably were. The last Native person that I know of who was buried in the burying ground was interred there in 1795, and that was the child of Abigail, an Indian woman. Native people lived in Hartford as servants, as merchants, as workers in the warehouses. They carried on their lives and had their homes there. The first person to pay taxes as a homeowner in Hartford, who was of Native descent, was a man named Japhet. So there were lots of Native people around. Unfortunately, we often don't know their names, because if you look at this slide, you'll see an unnamed Spanish Indian woman. A Spanish Indian was someone who probably came from either Florida, Puerto Rico, or possibly the Carolinas. Sometimes they were misnamed. But a lot of times names were not recorded. A squaw, meaning a Native woman, probably died there with no money. And then you'll see the last name on the slide, Waisiuka squaw, who was executed for a crime. Her name actually means the wife of Waisawisk. So we don't know her real name either. Of course, most of the people buried in the ancient burying ground are of English descent, colonial women from that era. A few women of Dutch descent may also be there. The exact number isn't really known. The earliest records list men as the founding members of the Congregational Church. There's an obelisk in the ancient burying ground that lists the names of the founders of Hartford, only two of whom were women, Dorothy Chester and Mary Webb. But it's very likely that wives followed their husbands as members of the Congregational Church. Under Reverend Timothy Woodbridge, a minister of the First Church, now called the Center Church, and also a former president of Yale, Sarah Bishop was the first to own the covenant. And Woodbridge baptized numerous women, both of African and English descent, And he kept very good records, unlike his predecessor. So we have, from Timothy Woodbridge forward, we have a pretty good idea of the women who were baptized, who owned the covenant. And then from the 1740s onward, a pretty good idea of the women who were buried there. A book called The Catalog of the First Church in Hartford starts in 1749. And while not exactly complete, it doesn't exactly correspond with the manuscript records. It is the most complete printed version of who is in the ancient burying ground. All of the people that we know of before that, we found in other records, manuscript records for the most part. So a little bit about the Congregational Church. When Connecticut was founded, Thomas Hooker separated from the Bay Colony, in part because he thought that there should not be such a restrictive rule for church membership. In the Bay Colony, people were required to give individual confessions of their conversion experiences to the minister. And Thomas Hooker thought that communion should be open to people if they wanted to receive it. And they had to be godly people, they had to be well-behaved people. But he didn't have a test, and he didn't refuse people membership in the church. So it was a fairly open thing, but you had to be both baptized and in communion. And to be in communion, you had to have some kind of conversion experience that they called justification. So although everyone had to attend the Congregational Church, at least in theory, not everybody was a voting member or a participating member in communion. The records show that in 1695-96, there was a boom in membership, and 64 women owned the covenant between March of 1695, that's using the old style Julian calendar, or March of 1696, and April 1696. Women had some very interesting names in the ancient burying ground, and you can see this is a photograph of a tombstone done under the Heritage Consultants Project. The ancient burying ground records some spectacular names. Azuba Warner was named for a biblical figure, the wife of King Asa and the mother of King Jehoshaphat of Israel, but her name meant desolation. And Puritans themselves, I think, sometimes had very interesting names. You may remember that one of the big parliamentarians was named Praise God Barebones. So it's not unusual to see rather extraordinary names, but most people were not named like that. They might have a name like Delight or Patience. There are a lot of women who were named Hope or Experience or Thankful. You might have been to the Thankful Arnold House in Haddam. The most common names were Mary, Sarah, and Abigail. And those names also became common for Native women, not just for women of English descent. Native women sometimes kept their original names, but colonists would call them by anglicized names. And of the extant stones, 49 have the name Mary, 30 Sarah or Sari, and 17 Abigail. I chose to focus on the Pratt family a little bit because they became prominent in Fairfield County later on in the Bridgeport area. So I thought I would give a tie-in here. But women in primogeniture was a topic I wanted to talk about because for the most part, Puritans believed in partible inheritance. They thought that all of the children should get a piece of the pie. And often the son would get a double portion, but all of the sons and daughters would get something out of the estate. Occasionally, you find some exceptions where the eldest son is left virtually everything, and all of the other children get, just monetary sums or some furniture, things like that. And the widow gets her widow's third, called a dower right. She was entitled to a third of the house and a third of its furnishings, and for use during her lifetime, but it was not something that she could pass on. And so John Pratt Sr. wrote his will just days before his wife Elizabeth passed away. And so he actually outlived her, so she wound up not inheriting anything in his will. But when he made provisions for her, he gave her her widow's third. And he does actually seem to be very concerned about his daughters. He left his daughters money, and he also left careful instructions for his son to take care of his mother, his wife, his sister, and his daughters. So John Jr., when he inherited his father's estate, did all of that, with the exception of his late mother. He did all of that. And when he died, he essentially still has the same estate that his father did. And he then makes provisions for his wife and on down the line. And he wound up with 5 daughters. And so he left them all a portion as well. But it's his sons who get the big inheritance. He mentions, though, that is John Jr., in his will, that his wife Hepzibah will be quietly seized in the house that he inherited, meaning she gets the parlor room and the furnishings in it for her lifetime, and that's her room to do with as she pleases. She can keep people out of it, or she can have people in it, but nobody can take it from her. Motherhood was very important to the Puritans. I've recently been engaged in discussions on a bill that's before the legislature on the exoneration of people accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. And one of the things that's come up in those hearings is what it meant to be a good woman and how women met that criteria, right? And sometimes how they didn't wind up meeting that criteria. And fertility was a big part of Puritan womanhood. It was important to have a large family. And while having children was not necessarily a tangible evidence of receiving grace and being one of the saved in Calvinism and congregational Christianity, a lot of people, I think, psychologically interpreted it as that. A woman who had many children was a favored woman. And mothers were venerated, especially if they were kind, if they were godly, if they were hardworking, and if they were deferential to their husbands. Puritan women were not oppressed in the way that we sometimes think, at least not in the philosophy of Puritanism. They were considered to be helpmeets, and men were supposed to consult their wives on major decisions. The man always had the final say, but women's opinions were to be taken into account. They were tasked with religious instruction of their young children. They were expected to be role models. At the same time, a woman legally fell under her husband, under coverture. She could not make contracts. She could not exercise control over her property. That was under the control of her husband. He was under an obligation not to waste it, but he was the only one who could sell it or divide it or use it for anything. While it was rare to see a grown man buried with his mother, we do have a couple examples in the ancient burying ground, and William Burr was interred with his mother in the same grave. We often do see infants buried with their mothers. Widowhood was also frequently a state women found themselves in. There are 35 extant headstones that bear witness to widowhood in the ancient burying ground. And you can tell this by the use of the word relict, which meant widow. She's literally the leftovers of her husband. Husbands protected wives in their wills. They were required by law to give them a widow's third and to make sure that they had some way to provide for themselves as much as the husband was able to make sure of that. Often they did not give control of their estates to women, but you might have noticed that John Pratt Jr. made his wife Hepzibah the executrix of his will. So some men did do that and entrusted their estates to their wives, especially if the wives were elderly and not likely to remarry. Younger men with younger wives worried that their wives might remarry and the new husband would favor their children over the original children. And so husbands tried to protect the children as much as possible in their wills. Frequently, a husband's debts ate up the entire estate. The colonial period was full of debtors and creditors. People relied on that for their businesses. They relied on that to keep their farms going. So it was not unusual to see quite a number of debts in estate inventories. And widowhood could send even prominent women into poverty. And I want to look for a moment at one of the women who's on that obelisk as a founder of Hartford, Dorothy Chester. Dorothy was the sister of Reverend Thomas Hooker. And she had a son who was fairly well off based on his estate inventory. But her son Leonard predeceased her. And so she wound up without a husband and without a son to take care of her in her old age. In Leonard's will, he left her only 30 pounds. And just to give you an idea, sort of how much that was. In the 17th century, the average farmer in the Connecticut River Valley probably had a yearly income of about 80 pounds. One of the African-American farmers that I profile in the Uncovering Their History project died with an estate of 100 pounds. And while he was on the lower end of farm estates, that would be something typical for a working class person. Many people in Hartford who came in as founders died with estates in the hundreds of pounds. So Dorothy did not have much to her name. And over time, she sold her land, probably to make ends meet. She sold off quite a number of acres in serial sales to take care of her living expenses. We also see, though, a widow like Sarah Waters, who left a will and left her daughter Mary a precious silver spoon in her will. A lot of women named their daughters or their daughters-in-law specifically and gave them objects that they considered to be important. Ruth Moore, for example, she was the wife of Philip Moore that I just talked about over in Hockenham, and she left her daughter a special frying pan. So women often singled out little possessions that they wanted to give to their daughters and female relatives. The objects in Sarah Waters' inventory include a book by Increase Mather and other books of sermons, feather bed and pillowcases, handkerchiefs some of which were silk. That tells you that she was a woman of means, because Puritans had sumptuary laws that restricted what kind of clothing people could wear. If you were not above a certain class and you were caught wearing silk, you could be punished for that. She had a striped petticoat, damask frock, and Holland shifts. And there's a picture of a Holland shift there. These were nice dresses with beautiful patterns. And Ruth Moore, I call her a colonial woman of color, and that might be a sort of a controversial choice of words, but the Moore family were landowners and appear in the land records in the year 1676. This is the earliest I have found any person of color owning land in Hartford. They were free people, and they had relatively substantial land holdings. They had an orchard lot, they had a wood lot, they had their home lot and farm. They grew flax. Although Ruth's inventory, as you can see here, is pretty meager. It has 8 pounds, 9 shillings, and I think 0 pence. Philip Moore left an estate of over 100 pounds and was able to give his sons land, was able to even give his son-in-law some of his property. And Ruth made her own will and had her own estate probated. She's the earliest woman of color that I've found to have had a will, and she's definitely interred in the ancient burying ground in Hartford. Very sadly, her son Philip Jr. died shortly after her, but she had other family members. And there's quite a large Moore family tree. John Moore married Lydia, and they had children. Philip Moore Jr. married Lydia, and they had several children, all of whom were baptized in the Congregational Church. They in turn had children, but the Moores began to fall on hard times. And in the year 1717, New London began considering banning the ownership of property by Black people. And there was some rumor that this might be enacted at the General Assembly in Hartford. Such a restriction would have been terrible for the Moores. So what the Moores began doing in 1717 is quit claiming land to their neighbors. And I don't have enough evidence to really tell you what was going on there. I don't know if they were secretly keeping possession of the land, hoping that their neighbors would save it for them, or if they were divesting. But the last Moore in this family that I can find in the Hartford records is in 1737. By then, the children of Sarah Moore were on poor relief. They were being taken care of by somebody who had been a neighbor of theirs, and somebody who had been on pretty equal footing for much of the time. And so this suggests that as more Black people are being imported into Hartford and Connecticut and New England in general in the slave trade, that the status of free Blacks is declining. That means that there would have been pressure on the Moores to leave Hartford, and they seem to have done that. At least I can't find any more records of them. And of course, another historian might be able to turn up something. We had a finite amount of time when I was doing the project, and I'm always hopeful that people doing their own genealogies will be able to link back. I think one of the important legacies of Ruth Moore is that as a free woman of color, she set an example by leaving a will. they wanted to belong to colonial society. They wanted to live as colonists. They had Bibles. I don't know if Ruth could read based on her, you can't tell based on her signature, which was an X. She might have actually been able to read and recite the Bible. That was a fairly common thing among Christian women, but writing was a different skill. And so a lot of women who could technically read or recite scripture could not sign their names. Her daughter, Susanna, or perhaps a stepdaughter, Susanna, was married to Cato Sessions. Cato worked for the Reverend Timothy Woodbridge as an indentured servant for a while when he fell into debt, and Woodbridge bought his debt in court and had him work as an indentured servant to pay the debt. But Cato was eventually freed from his indenture, and they owned a farm and farmed that land, but they too quit claim their property and appeared to leave the area. There were a number of women of color in the ancient burying ground. We know about 107 women and girls of color who were buried there. And what I've put in this slide is a screenshot of two profiles. When we made the Uncovering Their History project, we tried to give each person a sort of figurative headstone in which we put information. And that information included their name, if we had one, their age at death, if we knew it, the date of their death. Most of the time, we didn't know the dates of someone's birth, where their most recent residence was, what they died of, and where we found the records. We also tried to give a confidence level, because without headstones, remember, there's 6,000 people probably buried over time in the ancient burying ground. Most of those people don't have headstones. There are only 422 left. So we had to go based on written records about whether we thought someone was in the burying ground or not. So we have different statuses. Highly confident means they appeared on a sexton's record, or there's some indication they had a coffin made for them, something like that, that indicates they were in the burying ground. Somewhat confident means we really think they're there. They seem to have spent their whole lives in Hartford and probably died there. And then we have slightly confident, they, not quite as high as somewhat confident, but we still think there's a good chance they're there. And then the not confident, we really can't find any proof, but they're in Hartford for a substantial period of time, and maybe. We also tried to record their ethnicity, any national or tribal affiliation. Most of the time we didn't have anything like that, but if we did, we put it in there. We had 120 people for whom we had records of death, but no name. And these are 120 people of color that we identified in the Uncovering Their History project. You can see here the profile of a Negro woman. Her age at death was 102, and she died in 1773. There is absolutely no doubt that they knew her name, but they did not write it down. She belonged to Isaac Sheldon, a prominent man in Hartford. She is definitely there because she appears on a sexton's record, but she's just completely of unknown origins, and we were not able to match her to anyone. Every once in a while, one of those 120 people seem to match a record that we have with a name, and so we do try to we do try to attach those, but for the most part, all of those unnamed people will be unnamed forever. And now I'd like to introduce you to one of the people I think is sort of the most fascinating that I came across in the ancient burying ground. Of course, there are many, many stories to tell, but Madame Dubois came from Haiti. In the colonial records, they say she comes from San Domingo, but she came from Haiti at the time of the Haitian Revolution. Now, when I taught history at Central Connecticut State University, I taught courses on the American Revolution, but I also taught courses on Atlantic revolutions. And that's a way that historians have begun conceptualizing the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Latin American revolutions in 1810. And she's part of a big revolutionary sweep that comes at the end of the Enlightenment, just before the Napoleonic Wars, right? And then, of course, Napoleon himself creates other problems in the Caribbean. But Madame Dubois was born in France, in Angoulême, and she migrated with her husband to Haiti, to a place called Petite Gouave, and my French pronunciation is terrible, so I apologize if I'm butchering it, where she oversaw a habitation, which is what they called their plantations. There were about 30,000 free persons of color in Haiti in 1789, and 500,000 enslaved people on the eve of the French Revolution. The enslaved people in Haiti outnumbered free people by about 10 to 1. So this is what we talk about: absentee landlords, absentee plantation owners. Now, Madame Dubois lived on the plantation, but she was a widow. Her husband had recently died. And as the troubles started, she sent her son to France so that because he was still a minor, and she wanted to protect him. She ran the plantation herself until she became too ill and too worried to carry on. So she left in February of 1792 and came to Hartford, to the tavern of John Avery. Before she left, she wrote a will and she tucked a copy of that will into her chest of drawers on the plantation in Haiti, and then she brought copies with her. And so what you see at the bottom of the screen is her signature on her will in French. In the probate records in Connecticut, the will has been transcribed. And Madame Dubois was not in Hartford long before she succumbed to whatever illness had been plaguing her in Haiti, and she died at the age of 38. In her will, she gave bequests to several men and women of African descent still in San Domingo. She gave 2,500 Joes to 3 of her Black plantation managers. She was the godmother to someone described as mulatto, but whose name suggests that she was a quarter Black and 3/4 white. Her last name was Quartermain. And she has a number of maids, and she leaves them her clothing and small monetary bequests. The bulk of her estate, of course, went to her son. Her son returned from France to Petite Gouave and liberated the remainder of the enslaved people on the plantation. And we found records of that. I owe Cecilia Dyer of the Pequot Library a great debt because she's the one who found that record of the liberation of the slaves. Madame Dubois' death was recorded in the newspaper, in the American Mercury, in the Hartford Courant, and news of the violence in Haiti was covered by papers like the American Mercury, the papers in New London, all over the state. In the newspaper here, you can see that her name seems to be spelled Dubois. In ancient burying ground records, it's transcribed Duborn, but in the Connecticut wills and probate, it is correctly transcribed as Dubois. She had her funeral in the North Church, and then the funeral procession traveled to the ancient burying ground from the North Church. I tried to see if there was a reason that they had the funeral in the North Church, and there's some indication that the North Church around this time was starting to have anti-slavery sentiment, and later on had a bit of abolitionist sentiment that was fairly pronounced. I don't know if that's something that she was thinking about. She said in her will that she wanted to liberate more of the enslaved people on her plantation. She did give freedom to a few of them in her will, but she was worried that French law might not allow her to actually complete their manumission. I wanted to talk a little bit about, how I did this research. I went to a number of different sources, and the State Library, of course, is a great repository, and anybody can use it. The section in the basement called Genealogy and Archives, the staff are very welcoming and they're very knowledgeable, and they will help you find anything you need. I used their microfilm collections for wills and probate, for congregational church records that had not been transcribed, for records of Baptist churches and other denominations. The Congregational Church was the state church in Connecticut until our Constitution in 1818. The Connecticut, in fact, didn't ratify the First Amendment of the Constitution right away because they were afraid that it wouldn't allow Connecticut to maintain a state church. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they did it in a pro forma way. In the Roosevelt administration in the 20th century, they gave recognition to it. But Connecticut had a congregational church that got taxpayer money up until 1818. And other churches, by the 1740s, other churches were allowed to exist, but it was a difficult relationship. So most of the people who were covered in records are the Congregationalists. America's Historical Newspapers is a database available at universities primarily. It's a terrific database of most of the newspapers in the colonial period that were printed in English, and it complements early American imprints, which is sometimes referred to as the Evans bibliography, that has all of the published material between 1636 and 1801 that is published in North America. So everything written in North America, as North America was understood at the time, meaning a number of different languages, from Algonquian and Mohawk to French, English, Dutch, et cetera, but not including Spain or any of the Spanish territories. Chronicling America is from the Library of Congress, and that you can have free access to. I mentioned already the historical catalog of the first church in Hartford, very valuable, but its records are spotty and not complete, not accurately transcribed in all cases. The Connecticut Historical Society publications, especially the Willis Papers, which has great colonial records, and the particular court records. The particular court was sort of the equivalent of a county court that existed up until 1663 in the new charter. Once the new charter came in 1662, the particular court wound down its business. Connecticut wills and inventories. I want to point out here that if you're using this database on ancestry.com, that for many people, there are not separate indexed entries. Now, this is particularly true of people of color. If you try to find Philip Moore in the Connecticut Wills and Probate database in Ancestry, you will not find his name. And you will find him in Manwaring, a digest of the wills in Hartford County up to 1750, but not in the manuscript probate packets and probate court records. That was also true, though, of John Pratt Jr. So John Pratt Sr. is indexed by Ancestry, but John Pratt Jr. is not. And so what I do when I'm searching that database is I scroll through, this is essentially microfilm that Ancestry has processed, and I scroll through the microfilm looking for people. I don't just rely on the index. There are also mistranscriptions. So I will say that using Ancestry to find the will of Amy Puwamskin was a chore. I looked through 400 records because Ancestry had transcribed her name as Amy Square, a misreading of Amy Squaw, although the name Puwamskin was very clearly stated in the will. So you have to be careful using the Ancestry records, and I recommend using the Connecticut State Library for any serious searches that you're doing. The Connecticut Church Record abstracts are also on Ancestry and in the Connecticut State Library. These are hugely valuable because they cross-reference records in several different books, but they only apply to the Congregational Church. And the abstracts only have snippets of information. You have to go to the actual record if you want to get the full record. And some of those are only on microfilm. And lastly, I'd like to direct you to the Ancient Burying Ground website itself. You can see there the database for the photographed headstones and footstones. You can find there a link to the Uncovering Their History project, and you can get a link to the new projects that we have there, one on the West Indies, and so people who had ties to the West Indies who are buried in the Ancient Burying Ground. We have upcoming a story map that's going to take you through that journey. And then we also have the Women in the Ancient Burying Ground project website that will appear very shortly. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to having some questions, as I'm sure you must have many. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hermes. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing all that great information and research with us. And what an excellent way to wrap up Women's History Month to hear all of these fascinating stories. So now we have about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes remaining for some great Q&A. I see some people have already dropped their question in the chat. If you haven't done so yet, feel free to start dropping your questions in there. And I'll just get us started with one question. I would love to hear more about how you came to be involved with the Ancient Burying Ground Association, Dr. Hermes, and what brought you to that work and what the process has been like.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. So in 2018, the Ancient Burying Ground got a grant to look for people of color who were buried there, because a number had been thrown around in history books for a long time, 300 people of color buried in the Ancient Burying Ground, but nobody really knew who they were. And in some ways, this was sparked by a Fox Middle School class that did research on the Black governors. And the Black governors were Black men elected by the local constituency to be more or less it was a figurative governor in the sense that they didn't have any power at law, but they were important liaisons between the Black and the white community. And the Black governors had real power in their communities. And so the students did research on the Black governors, and then they also, in doing that research, found the names of some other people of color. And in 1998, they erected a monument that stands in the Ancient Burying Ground right as you go in from Main Street. You can see that monument, and it's lovely, but it does not have, I mean, just for reasons of size, it does not have a comprehensive list of the people of color in the Ancient Burying Ground. So once that call for proposals was put out, I was coming up on sabbatical, and I had been working for a long time on the Wangunk people in Hartford and in the surrounding region. And I have always thought it's important for ordinary people to be recognized in history. And it bothered me that these people were virtually unknown, unnamed people. So my proposal to the Ancient Burying Ground was, we create a profile for each person that we find. We create an Ancestry.com genealogy or family tree for each named person that we have. And we create relationship trees showing how people were related to their communities for select people in the database. And relationship tree was an idea that I had, and I worked with some computer science students to build that computer program, because in a genealogical tree, you can show your mother, your father, your grandparents on your maternal and paternal sides and out until your 80th relatives, you know, but you can't show your best friend. You can't show the person you owe money to. You know, there's so many relationships you can't map that are actually more critical than your aunt 80 times removed. So if that's a thing, I don't even know if that's a thing, but when we did those trees, then those relationship trees, then we wrote narratives. And so the website that you see recounts important relationships, familial and community relationships, has individual profiles, and then has narratives on important themes like the Atlantic slave trade or being in debt or family structure and those kinds of subjects. So that's how I became involved. And I love them. They're a terrific organization. They're planning ahead for the future. And they're really doing great things to the physical presence of the graveyard.
Incredible. Yeah, I was able to visit recently, and it's just such a great space. Anyone who's on this call right now who hasn't been, I highly recommend. We have another question from our audience. asking a little bit more about when you were speaking to owning the covenant. What does it mean to own the covenant?
Yep. So Puritans believed kind of a morphology of conversion, meaning steps toward conversion. And they believed that infants were born into a state of total depravity. And so you needed to baptize infants, and then you needed to raise them in a moral way, right? So that they would grow up to be good people. But Puritans did believe that not everyone was going to go to heaven or be saved, that some people were predestined to be damned. And so an important stage in this morphology was called justification. And that's when you experienced Jesus in your heart. You had and it was not, some people describe it as like a, bolt of lightning. You feel Jesus. And it wasn't like that. It was something you came to slowly over time, usually in your late teens or young adulthood, where you realized that you loved God and God loved you and you were saved. That experience of saving grace allowed you to, as they say, own the covenant and say that you were one with God. You made a contract with God for your salvation. And so that's what it means. They took these steps very seriously. And so not everyone could own the covenant.
So interesting. And another question about details. Could you say more about any of the red stone that we may see in so many ancient burial grounds in Connecticut?
So I believe most of that is Portland brownstone. And if you've been across the river to Portland, you can see those big quarries. If you go across Route 17 into Portland, so across the Connecticut River, and you go down Silver Street, there's a riverside park where you can see some of the huge rock and quarries back there. And and that's where they made a lot of the headstones.
It's such a beautiful stone too. That's so interesting. I didn't know that. And we have an audience member who would like to know more about Ruth Moore and kind of what her background is, particularly as a free Black woman in the North.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible find, really. I was so stunned when I came across her will. So let me start with Philip Moore, her husband. My speculation is that he was an enslaved man, probably African, who got land perhaps for fighting in King Philip's War. I mean, I don't know that, but just the timing of when you see him appear in the land records suggests that that might be the case. Ruth may have been his second wife, and she's described as both Negro and mulatto in the colonial records. And so mulatto was a term used for somebody who was part white and part Black. So if she were a mulatto, that suggests that perhaps her ancestors had been brought from West Africa and perhaps to the Caribbean. Now, a number of Hartford families had ties to the Caribbean. The Lords and Willises actually had a plantation in Antigua called the Cabbage Tree Plantation. It's possible that Ruth came from that plantation where she had both white and Black ancestors. But I don't know. I mean, the answer, so all of that speculation, I don't really know where she came from. What I think is interesting is that she's had probably enough education that she could speak English and understand it when it was spoken to her. There's some indication that she was fluent in English.
Thank you so much. We have another question about the presence or lack thereof of headstones that you mentioned in the ancient burial ground. Can you speak a little bit more about that and how that came to be?
So, the ancient burying ground, it occupied so much more territory than it does now. As I said earlier, probably about 6 acres, 5 or 6 acres. And it's estimated that you can have about 1,000 burials per acre. So that's how we kind of arrive at that number of 5,000 to 6,000 burials. Now, much of that has been covered over by streets, buildings, right? Just the city encroaching on everything. And we know that in, I think, the early 19th century, someone did an inventory of headstones, and there were just a little over 500 headstones then. So we've lost about 100 since then. Probably many people did not have headstones for a number of reasons. Some Puritans did not believe you should have a headstone. They thought it was vain. And so even if they could afford one, they chose not to have one. Some people may have had wooden markers, wooden crosses, other kinds of wooden markers, particularly African people. There are other cemeteries like in Long Island and in New England, where people of African descent have wooden markers and they don't last as long. A lot of Native people would not have a carved marker, but they might have had stones, which then get removed and that sort of thing. And then impoverished people could not have afforded a stone. So a stone could probably cost as much as 40 or 50 pounds. So if you think about Dorothy Chester's estate, right? She only has 30 pounds in her estate at the end of her life. So headstones were expensive and they grew in cost over time. So that's probably why a lot of people don't have them. And then you can see what's happening because of acid rain and things like that. Headstones all over the state are crumbling.
Thank you so much for that. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So our next question from our audience, someone would like to know if there was a time in Connecticut colonial history when land ownership was restricted or illegal for people of color.
So I mentioned earlier, that there were these proposals to restrict Black land ownership. I don't see any evidence that those laws were passed. So although there were proposals, as far as I know, there were no restrictions on it. I think the restrictions were more just de facto. It was hard to accumulate wealth. So for people who were enslaved, even if they bought their freedom later, it was very hard to accumulate enough wealth to buy land. And in particular, to buy land in Hartford after a long period of colonial settlement, because that land was taken up by white people pretty early on. There's some evidence that land ownership became scarce because of increased prejudice. And that's kind of harder to prove, but we see here like the Moores, right, who have pretty substantial land lots, and seem to be well positioned, and then they have to quit claim their land and they're kind of pushed out. And so I don't really see Black landowners of that kind of, with that kind of substantial holding again, after the late 17th century. And then not again really until the 19th century.
I'd love to close this out with, being able to hear a little bit more about some of the exciting initiatives you mentioned coming up for the Ancient Burying Ground Association. So I know there's been this recent project of photographic documentation.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about those projects and what the accessibility goals behind them are and where people can find them to learn more?
I think one of the great things is that we've created databases for both the Uncovering Their History project and the photography project that are downloadable. And so you can use these yourself if you need to for any reason. Like if you want pictures, they're readily available. If you want the data, that's readily available. There are also physical projects going on, right? Trying to fix some of the table stones in particular, to both restore the tabletop and what's carved on it, as well as shore up some of the foundations of these table stones, which are, pretty rocky. And the president of the Ancient Burying Ground Association, Ty Tryon, has been able to get some grants to help with that, to just make the physical area more secure for the stones that are there. So I think that's exciting, and hopefully there'll be other small grants that will look into more projects. We had recently a project where they did a brochure on people connected to the witchcraft cases in Hartford and who's buried in the Ancient Burying Ground. As far as we know, there are no women accused of witchcraft buried there. We don't, as I say, we don't know. There's no reason they couldn't be, but there were men connected with the trials that we know are there. So that's a great brochure. If you stop by, you can pick up one of those.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I will be sending out all of the links that Dr. Hermes mentioned in a follow-up email. So if you didn't catch any of them, don't fear. We will share them with you so you can download all of those great resources. We are just about at our closing time. So I would love to thank you so much, Dr. Hermes, for this wonderful lecture. And I know our invisible audience is giving you a virtual round of applause.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I wish I could see everybody. I'd love to do it in person sometime.
Next time, that will be our part 2. But thank you so much for joining us. And it's been wonderful to have you kick off this lecture series. As I mentioned to everyone, this is the first part of a 4-part series. So we would love to have you come back for our next lecture, which will be on Thursday, April 13th with the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project and Amanda Davis. And then we'll have a couple more in May with the South Asian American Digital Archive and the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. So I will send out the links for those registration pages and dates to you all, as well as a survey. We would love to have your feedback, as always, to hear how we can continue providing programming that is useful and engaging to you and improve on what we are offering. So thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. And once more, thank you so much, Dr. Hermes, for joining us. I know you have an incredibly busy schedule, so we appreciate you taking the time to share the wealth of information research that you have. And thank you again to the Ancient Burying Ground Association for partnering with us on this wonderful talk tonight.
Our pleasure.
Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your evening.
Good night.